G'day YouTube. Save trees, save energy, save Earth. There you are. Now you know from the beginning what it actually says on Warbles' new Christmas t-shirt. A gift from the darling Dottar child who lives in a yurt and now keeps a spare bedroom for guests on Warble Daddy's endangered species sanctuary. And what can I say? The particular house guest she's got down here at the moment is the great granddaughter of a friend of mine who I unfortunately had to go and attend their funeral service 2 weeks ago. So, okay, today it is in fact January of the 26th, a black day which reeks of infamy in the consciousness of anybody who knows the story. And as the funeral was for a friend of mine who I'd known for 32 years, who was, when she died, the oldest member of the Ngurrabal tribe, the traditional owners of this land on which I live. I think it's really only fair if I dedicate this video, made on the 26th of January 2023, about what some people call Australia Day and the rest of us call Invasion Day, dedicated to the memory of Auntie Mary Byrne, as I used to know her, wife of Uncle Keith. If you look in my back catalogue, you'll find that his funeral service is on my YouTube channel, as was that of his son, or their son, Warren, who I knew as Dale. Nice little touch. At Mari's funeral, they gave away those little laminated photos. There were several different varieties, but this was the same one as was on the funeral brochure. So, I suppose on Invasion Day 2023, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea if, instead of dwelling solely on the historical record and the textbooks that I've got and the accounts that I can lay my hands on, I thought it might be interesting if I told you the story of how I come to be friends with Keith and Mary Byrne. And because it's Invasion Day, and I'm basically making a sad video, I'm afraid I'm going to indulge in a very naughty bad habit called daytime drinking. A decision of which Mary would probably not approve, but I feel fairly certain she would almost certainly understand. Cheers, Barley, Mary and Keith, and Dale, and his big brother Chris. And to give you a really early preview peek at the circular narrative closure of the story, the particular friend of my daughter's who's camping in her spare bedroom, as I said, is the great-granddaughter of Mary and Keith Burns. When I was asked, Dad, is it all right if young girl comes up and camps in my backyard, which is what that is now, it's Elizabeth's backyard, while she sort of sorts her head out and figures out what she's going to do next. On the one hand, I had all these white supremacist, Euro peon induced ideas of mine. And on the other hand, I'm thinking, well, if I can't welcome Keith and Mari's great-granddaughter to camp on my place until she's got her head sorted out, what the fucking hell is the point of being friends with the great-grandparents for 35 years if I'm not going to be as useful as I can be, as helpful as I can be. And what's the point in me talking about how I heard an Aboriginal bloke from Fraser Island describing the essence, the core essence of their culture could be summed up by three principles. On the first principle, whatever the land needs, whatever's best for the land, that has to be priority number one. Doesn't matter what you want to do, doesn't matter what you'd like to do, doesn't matter what your ambition to do is. What you have to do is what's best for the land. Number two, you don't ever take anything that's not yours. Number three, if you have plenty, you must share. Pretty sure I got enough land to share if somebody wants to camp in my daughter's spare tent. I'm pretty sure I got enough land to spare. So I sort of feel as if I'm at least attempting to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. But where the talking started was 32 years ago. I paid $400 an acre for 100 acres as symbolised by a piece of paper. And the piece of paper, they call it a title deed, and the title deed said that I didn't acquire the airspace rights. Okay, there's a man on the throne in England who's ultimately, he says, who's allowed to fly in the air over my little patch of forest. Because if you disagree, then you can fight your way up through the entire Commonwealth Police and the Federal Police and the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. Eventually, they're going to call on Mother England for help, and you're going to wind up with, whatever the King of England can muster to dispute your hypothesis that you control the airspace rights over your block of dirt. So no, you don't buy the airspace rights when you buy a block of dirt. Anybody can fly over it. You don't buy the mineral rights. You own the top 6 inches. You don't own the water rights when you buy a title deed. You're allowed to keep 10% of what runs off. And what runs off is generally about 10% of what falls on the ground. So you only get to keep, at law, without special extra different paperwork, 1% of what falls on the ground. What the title deed does entitle, pardon the oxymoronic double use of the same word, what it allows you to do lawfully is to spend as much of your money as a landholder on attempting to wrest a profit from the land which you have purchased. Here it is assumed that I can run 40 bar lambs, and I have to pay the Pastures Protection Board or Meat and Livestock Industry levy. It boils down to being about $150 a year, because they assume that I am going to run 40 sheep on this place, and they assume I'm going to run them at a profit, and because they assume I'm going to be competent to keep more alive, and they assume I'm going to sell them at a profit after deducting me transport costs and me dipping and drenching and mulesing and crutching and lambing, all that. And then they expect me to pay them for the work they do in helping all of the bar lamb producers and all of the moo cow producers. And short of going to the National Parks and Wildlife Service and getting a voluntary conservation agreement on this place, which in theory binds everybody who ever buys it in perpetuity to running it as an endangered species sanctuary, there is no way of getting out of paying the council rates and the PP board rates. And that sort of, it amounts to about $1,000 a year. But that's all you get, is you get the right to try and make a profit, spend as much as you like, go as broke as you can, as fast as you can. And if you kill everything alive on that land that you have purchased, that is deemed to be good news for the economy because you tried. You worked hard. You scratched your entrepreneurial European itch to harvest everything. And when I read that, I thought, shit, I'm not going to do that. My parents sent me to school where I got stuck with bloody biology for 4 consecutive 3-month terms in a row, so I understand how the environment works. I come out of high school with a fairly good grip on it. The more life occupies the space, the more life can occupy the space. If you walk up to a functional food forest and you try and smash, bash, crush, flatten it, wipe it all out so you can grow a single artificial plant species, either as a crop in itself or to feed some other single artificial animal species, what you are attempting to do is the exact diametrical opposite of evolution and biology and life on Earth. And therefore you deserve to fail. It may take you a while to fail. The first harvest everythingists, 12,500 years or so ago, in the lesser dryads around southeastern Turkey, they harvested everything and they carried seeds and fruits and food from so far in so many different directions in the middle of the dead, bare, bald dust bowl that they were creating, that eventually the seeds they pulled from 250 kilometres that way grew and fertilised with the product of the seeds they'd pulled from 500 kilometres that way, and the hybrid strain grew better than either of the wild harvested strains. And 300 years after the first hybrid strain went into the midden at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey 12,300 years ago, 12,270 years ago, because for the first 30 years, all the seeds in their midden were wild harvested. First wild seed goes in, 300 years later, all the seeds in the midden were hybrid strains. 400 years after that, the city had been abandoned twice, and the survivors of the second abandonment, they actually backfilled the place and covered it over with sand and rocks and rubble and went goat farming on the hill that resulted. There's not much you can do to tell your ancestors that they made a bigger mess than just backfilling everything they ever did, covering it over. We want to bury that, get rid of that. That was a stupid fucking idea. You know, it's a bit like going and digging your great-grandfather up and using his soul as a soccer ball to teach his ghost what a bastard you think he was. So anyway, they created the desert, first desert that had ever been created. And about 5,000 years later, the survivors from Göbekli Tepe, they'd covered all of Europe. There were these little proto-settlements of, up to 1,000 people living in one patch of rich soil where there was a good river to water it, and they had no sewage, and they were just making a mess everywhere, and it was your sort of bust, boom, plague, famine-regulated society. But out in Ukraine, there was a mob of horse milk drinkers. They were called Yamnayans, and they were tall, and they were dedicated to looking after the horses that had captured them, I guess, because once you own a horse, you got a drought on your land, and you are obliged to somehow find fresh pasture for the horse. So as soon as these Yamnayans got themselves built and established, they found they'd run out of pasture, and the only obvious solution was to get on the horse and ride to the neighbouring countryside and kill all the men and marry and enslave all the women, and then pasture your horses out where they used to live. And they started about 6,000 years ago. And within 1,000 years of them starting out in Ukraine, they'd gone all the way, I'm talking from your point of view, all the way west to Spain, to the Spanish Atlantic coast, all the way east to the Siberian Pacific coast, all the way north to the top of Norway, all the way south to the bottom of bloody India, all over Southeast Asia. They did not get south of the Sahara Desert, but they got all of that, the top end of Africa. And then that brings us to what happened to cause the rise of the cities when, outfits like the city of Ur and the Babylonians and the Egyptians, they all came out of the wave of agriculture and harvest everythingism, which was spawned by the Yamnayans taking the Göbekli Tepe cult of harvest everythingism and spreading it all over Europe and Eurasia. I suppose you could say that Leif Erikson was the first Yamnayan who got to bloody North America, but he didn't stay there or last there. The first Yamnayans got to England about 5,000 years ago, And as soon as they got there, all work on Stonehenge stopped, and 100 years later, there were no more British testicles, no more British Y chromosomes going into any burial ground anywhere in the British Isles. All the Y chromosomes were Yamnayans because the Yamnayans had just taken over the British Isles in less than 100 years, killed all the men, married and enslaved the women. Captain Cook, sorry, yeah, Captain Cook, he showed up here after going to Tahiti. And when he went to Tahiti in 1769 in June, he got here in 1770. And the first Aborigine that Captain Cook met, and he was the first Yamnayan that the Aborigines had met, apart from Dirk Hartog and William Dampier, who did things on the northwestern coast of Western Australia when their ships headed for Indonesia got lost. And Abel Tasman, who hit Tasmania and thought it was full of giants. But barring those three, the first Yamnayan that the Aborigines ever met was Captain Cook, and he shot the first Aborigine that the bloody British Royal Navy ever met. And then he went home. He buggered his boat and had to fix it up, but he was a pretty good sailor, and he managed to fix his boat at Endeavour Bay on Queensland coast. And then the British, who had just got kicked out of the North American continent, they needed somewhere else to put their overpopulated, unemployed slum dwellers in the cities, the people who were burgeoning in population and there was no actual industrial economical position for them. I can't speak with great confidence what it was like in the 1700s, but in 1832, a silk weaver in Spitalfields was paid something like 2 shillings and sixpence per week, and they lived on 6 kinds of food, and they worked like daylight to dawn, daylight to dusk, 6 days a week. And it was like rice and tea or coffee, flour and sugar and salt, and meat maybe one day per week, perhaps. The conditions in Europe were absolutely wretched when they were told that, oh, we found this marvellous, huge continent, the land of milk and honey and prosperity. It's just great. Come out here and, we will colonise Australia. We will walk all over Australia. And a colon is a long, muscular tube lined with a mucous membrane and full of half-digested shit. So when the Europeans, the landless, ignorant peasant plus from Europe comes, when they showed up here, they colonised the place, right? They emptied their colons all over everything they didn't understand. They camped in one spot with no clear plan of moving away as soon as they'd exhausted the resources of that spot. That's part one that was wrong. They fed the Murnong yam daisies. They fed the tops, the solar panels of the Murnong yam daisies. They fed that and every other ground-dwelling food plant that humans could eat. They fed that to the sheep and the goats and the cattle and the horses. And it took maybe 5 years of sheep being anywhere for there to be no more human food plants. And then the sheep competed with the prey animals that the Aborigines used to be able to hunt. So overpopulation of livestock denuded the land and swept it bare, and their hard hooves hammered the soil into a hard crust. So when it rained, instead of soaking into the light, fluffy topsoil, which acted like a sponge and held the moisture, the British actually wanted to use cloven hard hooves to hammer the landscape into this hard surface so water would run off and form sheets, and that was going to fill up rivers and lakes, and they were going to transform the countryside into an English country garden, they thought. And what actually happened was it ran off all right, and it eroded and it put the bloody topsoil at the bottom of the rivers, but they didn't mind that because they'd already caught all the fish in the rivers. And then the rivers filled up with silt and you couldn't go anywhere on them. In fact, all the rivers going west from the Great Divide, they didn't even drain the land in the way they do in Europe and North America and South America. Over here, the westward headed rivers, they ran between levee banks of detritus built up in previous floods. So water level was sometimes 5 or 10 metres vertically above the level of the surrounding floodplain. So before the whitefellas came here and fucked everything they touched through ignorance and arrogance and hubris and jingoism and got mit uns theory, it rained really heavily on the mountains, and all the water that went west was carried out there metres above the ground in earthen levees, so the water percolated from the river down into the landscape and kept the floodplain fertile. That's what used to happen. And the water in the river was 20, 30, 50 feet deep, and it was absolutely crystal bloody clear and teeming with fish. It's not like that now. Did you see what Barney Baby Joyce, my Member of Parliament's fucking brilliant work, licensing the water to his irrigation farmers in Queensland, did to the inland rivers during the drought? He killed every bloody fish in the inland rivers, chasing increased profitability and productivity. You know how to make something more productive? You squeeze its ducts. Next time you see someone feeding the baby, go up and grab their tits and squeeze them really fucking hard and see if it makes any more milk come out. See how popular you are with the mother and the baby. That's what making something more productive means. Squeeze the ducts. Make more milk and honey flow from the tits of Mother Earth. Where were we? Put the topsoil at the bottom of the fucking rivers after killing the fish. Shot all the birds out of the bloody sky. Because, well, they might eat your crops. The cockatoos and the galahs might eat your wheat or your corn or whatever it was you wanted to grow so fucking much or you couldn't eat it all and you had to put it in a bag and put the bag on a boat and ship it to fucking England. What for? To feed the market demands of Europe. Nothing Europe ever did to Australia was done for the benefit of Australia. Everything Europe and America and the Northern Hemisphere did to Australia has been done in order to extract the resources of the Australian continent and feed it to the market demands of Europe. It's absolutely fucking disgusting. And it was all done on the hypothesis of terra nullius, because Captain Cook and Arthur Phillip were unable to find any Aboriginal person who would so misrepresent reality as to sign a treaty binding all tribes on the continent to their personal agreement with that one Euro peon. Therefore, the legal beagles and briefcates in the law chambers in London decided that nobody lived in Australia. It was terra nullius. We can't find anybody who'll sign a treaty with us and give us permission to fucking steal their land, so they must not exist. The land belongs to nobody. Long live the king. Rule Britannia, marmalade and jam. 5 Chinese crackers up your asshole! Bang, 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 bang! Rule Britannia, marmalade and jam for Britons in Britain, prosperity for the white pricks. 5 Chinese crackers up your asshole because the fucking Europeans didn't invent gunpowder. They bought it from the fucking Chinaman. Bang, 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 bang. Because that's what the fucking Europeans did to the rest of the world. Raid, smash and grab it all today is the way of Europeans. They stole the whole world and now destroy it on the run. It's been giving me the shits for fucking years. So anyway, we were talking about Keith and Mari Burns and how do I come to know them. Well, you see, I paid for that bit of paper. I paid $40,000 32 years ago for 100 acres, that I was to be responsible for everything alive within the 100 acres. I could kill it all and go broke, paying bulldozers to smash it flat, and then find no bastard wanted to buy anything that I could produce. Or I could stick with the theory that you can pay the rates on 100 acres out of the dole if you go far enough out of town. And if you can pay the rates out of the dole, then in Australia you can pretty much, you can't be kicked off. And then the land can have time to heal and get over 130 years of bloody sheep farming. And then we might see what it's good for in the fullness of the time. And what I found that this particular patch is good for is it's a didgeridoo factory. If you look at other videos in my Aboriginal technology playlist, you'll see that I've found not only a whole lot of preformed didgeridoos that have been fortuitously resulting from the weather conditions and the geology, so that when you get droughts every 20 years, enough saplings die and then recover so that you get a dead sapling surrounded by a cylindrical tube of living tissue, and then that dies in the next drought. So all you got to do is come up here and find the hollow saplings that are dead, push them over, cut the ends off them, and smooth them out and clear the centre of the dead out, and you got your didgeridoo. So I found quite a few of these when I first came here. I also found a hell of a lot of food plants of all kinds of different species, almost as if somebody had come here with a heap of food and eaten what they had and thrown the seeds out, and then lived off the seeds off the stuff that was here to harvest, and then they've gone away and somebody else has come and done it again. And the people from the LongWarbleRant tribe, Auntie Mari's people, the ones there, because that's the boundaries of LongWarbleRant. I did also colour in down there where I used to go and spend my holidays as a kid. So that's kind of a bit of Aboriginal land that I am slightly familiar with. There's a lot of Aboriginal land. The LongWarble, they apparently did not make didgeridoos or undakis, but I don't have any trouble at all finding half-made undakis that have been put aside and left in the forest waiting for the next time somebody comes along and wants to make a didgeridoo. Here on the didgeridoo factory, where the raw material, that's the other end of it, that is to say living trees surrounding dead tubes ready to be harvested as didgeridoos, is in absolute abundance. And because nobody wants to carry heavy stone tools with them when they go places, and they do want to be able to have a feed when they get there, they throw their food plant seeds all over the place. Look at that. 3 species in 1 square metre. And there's another one. And a different one again. They throw their food plant seeds out. But what about their tools? Well, this is what I found on the ground. And that there is a curved edge of the stone spokeshave. And that's a bigger curved edge of the stone spokeshave. And this one, as you can see, it's calibrated for your didgeridoos. That one there is more like for a nulla, the handle of a club. So that when you throw your spear at a kangaroo or a wallaby and you get the spear stuck in the side of its leg and it can't hop away from you, then you run in with your nulla and dong it on the head. And that's sort of my understanding of one fairly popular way to go about acquiring some taste and some grease. The 15% meat that went around the plant foods gathered mainly by the women and children. The men come up with the 15% meat, the taste and the grease. And yeah, spear to make the kangaroos slow down, and a club to inflict massive cerebral trauma and kill it. And then you can start using your stone knives, sharp little shattered blades for skinning. I don't know whether that is absolutely fortuitous or whether it happened as a result of a bulldozer going over a basalt rock, but it's pretty bloody functional. But this one, it's absolutely exquisite. It's, let's see if I can get some better light on it. Look at that. It's got like a 7-degree convergence. And as far as I can tell, this is an absolutely fortuitous frost-shattered, exfoliated, weathered basalt flake. But by Jesus, it'd be handy if you had to butcher a carcass, would it not? And of course, you know, what do you do with your grass seeds? Well, see, that end hasn't been ground and that end has. And there we have a pestle, and here we have a grinding groove, and there we have a couple more pestles, and we have quite a nice little bowl ground out by somebody grounding seed there, and somebody using something in a groove like that, backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And there's another one. Now, I cannot tell a lie. This is the only one that I actually found up here out of all of these. This, I'm pretty sure it has been used. This, I think one end of it, yeah. This end is a lot smoother than that end, so I think that end's been used. This one has not been used, but it's an example of raw material ready to be used. This, again, raw material ready to be used. There's not enough polishing on the inner surface of that one. Yeah, but this is Dinky Die. It was behind my parents' house in Lawrence Street in Beginneth. And I know there is a point of view that says anybody who shifts any kind of a suspected artefact is an asshole and a wicked evil bastard. But my experience is if I find what I think is an artefact on the ground out here and I put it on top of a tree stump so I can find it again later if I want to show it to somebody, I can't find that bloody thing later on when I go back to get at it. It'll show itself to me once. If I bring it here and I put it where I can find it again, then at least it does not get lost. And there's been such great loss in the last 235 years that, well, it's a bit like when I asked the local tribal elders for permission to make and paint and sell boomerangs and bull roarers. And they said, well, at this point, mate, any alteration would have to be an improvement on the state of play at the moment. So although I was raised to be a white fella in the local town of Glen Innes, for some reason training didn't take. And now I've been living on an endangered species sanctuary for slightly over half my life, and I've made and painted and sold about 50 boomerangs and a few magic spell enhancers as well. So I've been watching as the rest of Australia slowly wakes up to itself and makes understandings that they seemed fairly startling to me when I made them in the 1980s. And I really only woke up to the depth of the bullshit that we got laid on us in the 1960s with the orthodox white view of things. Because I can remember what it was like before the citizenship referendum. I can remember when Aborigines were counted with the fucking sheep and the cattle. The pastoralists put them on their census forms as native wildlife. And there was a lot of embarrassment on the world stage caused by that. Put there so he can join the conversation. And I remember my old man he was 52 years older than me, and he knew a thing or two because his father was a wheelwright woodsman, which meant that he'd grown up as a young man and a teenager hanging around the bullock drovers, so he'd been exposed to all the oral history that you could pick up in the 1890s about what had happened in the previous 40 or 50 years, maybe the previous 100 years around Armidale. Well, Armidale first whitefellas went there in 1832, so if my grandfather was learning to make wagon wheels in the 1890s in Armidale as he was, that was only 60 years since first contact. And well, I was talking to my brother about 8 years ago, and I mentioned that he'd done well finding my place up here, especially on a cloudy, rainy winter day. And he said, I never have any trouble finding this place. I said, why is that? He said, because our grandfather used to bring him up here during the 1940s and 1950s looking for charcoal for the blacksmith forge at Wharton's Garage. So it turns out I bought my own grandfather's charcoal mine. And when people comment on that, or I mention it to them, and they say that's pretty weird, and I say, yeah, imagine how a real blackfella feels. If I feel this sense of ownership because 10 years before I was born, my grandfather used to come here to get charcoal for his forge, imagine how a blackfella feels. Looking at land that their family's been on. Well, there's a thing called Project DNA Nation, where after DNA analysis was developed and invented and perfected, they went looking for things that might be interesting to apply it to. And somebody said, well, look, when the first missionaries got to Australia, they started running around collecting hair samples from the Aborigines from the 1820s and 1830s. And they kept these hair samples, and they didn't know what they were going to be good for. But now we've got DNA analysis. Why don't we get the hair samples and we'll compare them with the hair of the people who are living there today, if there's any local Aborigines who reckon they've lived there since time immemorial, and then we'll go and dig up some of their old burial grounds and we'll get DNA analysis on the hair, on the bodies in their old burial grounds. And what they found sort of shocked the bejesus out of them, because they already knew that 40,000 years ago during an ice age there had been an in-migration across a land bridge from Papua New Guinea across the Wallace Line through Indonesia and then across the land bridge to Australia. And they figured it had taken 1,000 years for those people to settle around the coast and another 1,000 years to move in and settle the centre of Australia. But what the Project DNA Nation, because they'd figured all that out from the carbon dating for campfires, Project DNA Nation told them that the DNA of the people who were living there today matched the familial DNA of the people who were there in the 1820s and 1830s when the whitefellas showed up, and the DNA of the people who were there in the 1820s and 1830s when the whitefellas showed up, it matched the burials for the past 40,000 years. And what they come to the conclusion of was that the Australian language groups, the clans, the tribes, they stayed on their land for 40,000 years continuously, didn't move away. They stayed there. And 2 ice ages came and went. And the Australians stayed where they bloody were. And they adapted it, and they had a sufficiently stable culture that they could work for 2 hours per person per day to supply all their food, clothing and shelter needs. And the rule was everything you made was yours to keep. You could trade it, you could give it away, or you could use it. Everything you harvested or you gathered, you had to give away 90% of that. So no matter how bad your day was, nobody ever went to bed hungry. And you compare that to today, where instead of 2 hours per person per day, people are working 35 or 50 hours a week. And instead of giving away 90% of everything they find for free, they give away 30, 40, 50% of everything that they earn. And with this marvellous new system, the landscape has been denuded. A free-range human couldn't fucking feed himself. And somebody goes to bed hungry every night of the week. More and more people every year. And the whole idea of the colonisation, as it was told to me back in, say, 1965, 66, when I first started asking questions as a really little kid, is that the people who believed in terra nullius and their descendants, they justified their behaviour by telling themselves that the Aborigines did not know how to use and exploit their land properly. Therefore, Europeans had to take it and show them how to use it better. And they would immediately go into a recitation of production statistics and figures for how much wheat, how much wool, how much meat, how much wood, how much grain, how much fucking everything Australia was exporting, and how many people Australia's 11 million when I was a kid were feeding all over the world, and that was touted as being a great thing because we were stealing the accumulated resources of 40,000 years of conscious effort maintaining the resources of the continent, and we were selling it for short-term gain so that some rich pricks in Europe could get even richer. And that was great. That's marvellous. That's what Australia's for. That's why nobody in Australia gets the shits at foreign investors coming and sinking their money into destabilising the Australian culture. That's why Johnny Howard said that anybody who had more than $1 million could come to Australia as a business migration visa holder and get the rapid fast track to citizenship, because he wanted to get all the white supremacists from white South Africa and shift them to Australia and import a new ruling class who would vote Liberal National and make the lives of the workers fucking hell. And put the blackfellas and the chinks and the chows and the Chinamen and the jippos and the wops in their fucking place too, because that's how Johnny Howard and his Liberal National arsehole cronies think. And it's why Peter Dutton, the fucking Voldemort of the Liberal Party, is now harping on again and again and again. Oh, but we want to know the detail. We want to know the detail in advance of everything that Parliament's ever going to say or do about Aboriginal citizenship, voice to Parliament, through to... We've got to know it all in advance before we have the citizenship referendum and vote on saying, yes, Aboriginal people, the traditional owners of this continent, should have a voice to Parliament. That is deemed to be offensive by the white supremacists and the little dick Christians who think that God created Australia for them to conquer. And it gives me the shits. It gives me the shits. Sanctimonious, self-righteous, smug, hubristic fucking idiots who light fires to make their food get cold. Electric refrigerators and coal-fired power stations. When I was a kid, burning coal and burning kerosene was about the only way you could refrigerate anything. Now I'm a geriatric, just about. You've got to be 65 to be a geriatric, and I'm 63 next month. Now I'm nearly a geriatric. I've got a bloody fridge in a lawn locker, and it runs on a solar panel and a battery. My daughter's got a similar fridge with a similar solar panel, and she lives in a freaking tent. You don't have to burn fossilised bacteria from the plesiosaur or whatever it was. You don't have to burn fossils to make your food get cold. And we've still got these bloody morons complaining that they want somebody to magically make the price of electricity in the cities go down because it costs them $30,000 a month to light up the fridges and their shop fronts at night when the doors are shut and nobody's there. And they've got to do that because they're afraid of some of the fucking hungry, harmless, homeless kicking their door in looking for somewhere to sleep for the night. I'm so glad my daughter nudged me to do the right thing and say, yeah, sure, your friend can come here and stay until they sort their fucking life out. I don't think they're going to want to stay here forever, but, you know, if I've been saving this place from being farmed in the hope that it might have a better chance of restoring itself in the future for future generations, and my kid wants one of her friends to come up here and have a bit of a camp and a breather, I'd have to be a seriously selfish arsehole to say no to that, wouldn't I? Well, that's the thing, see? I'm sharing the planet with 8 billion seriously selfish arseholes. Me. Mine. It's all mine. I want mine. I want more. None of them are fucking happy. If they see a paddock full of any kind of plant that's at an edible stage, they don't want to fucking pick one and move on. They don't want to pick an armload and take it home for their family. They want to get a fucking tractor and harvest a fucking lot and take it and put it in a freezer and then put it in little packet bags and then burn fossils to ship it all around the fucking world and make $1 million out of that one paddock. The whole system revolves around collecting all of the goodness in a large area, bagging it up and shipping it away and giving it to some other prick who's already fucked their country. Somebody who, in the greater scheme of things, probably deserves to be hungry for a while until they work it out. They may have done such a shit ass job that their kids are going to starve, and that land's going to get a big rest from people. That is the nature of evolution. The idea that we have foiled evolution with modern scientific progress, that's fucking bullshit, because all we've done is overpopulated the planet, denuded the landscape, crashed every ecology within the biosphere, and now we all get to fucking die because the wheels are falling off. The wheels are falling off the life support mechanism of planet Earth. There are a few good signs. This year, there's a bigger and stronger groundswell of local councils announcing they are no longer going to hold citizenship award ceremonies on the 26th of January because a greater, ever increasing percentage of the Australian population, particularly everybody under 50, is of the opinion that the 26th of January is a disgusting, shameful besmirchment upon Australia's history and reputation. We should be calling it Invasion Day and spending the whole fucking day walking around wearing a black armband and apologising to every Indigenous person we meet for the fucking mess we've made of their country. There's a groundswell of workers and management petitioning the executives that they work under to be allowed to go to work today because they don't want to honour the date of Invasion Day by having a holiday. They want to have their Australia Day holiday, their public holiday, on any other day of the year. What they're saying is May the 8th would be a pretty good day for Australia Day because if you write it as M full stop, indicating that you've abbreviated the word 8, M8, it's Australia Day, mate. I'm not objectionable to that idea. If you want to celebrate the good things that Australian society has done, and I'm fully aware that Australian society as a society has got good points. It's got some fucking horrible points, but it's got some good points. When I was a nurse, I never held my hand out for a gap payment. When I got split lickers disease, sexually transmitted cancer of the mouth and throat from talking the underpants off too many sweet young things back when I was young, the grateful nation of Australia accommodated me at the coast, diagnosed me, treated me, sent me home with no teeth, but I've still got my pension. We used to have a really laudable, admirable, enviable public health system. It is being underfunded and overworked, and it's collapsing and it's falling to fucking pieces. And if I want to see a doctor now, I have to pay money up front and get a refund, which means I have to be able to put my hand on the money up front in order to see a doctor. So Medicare is It's dying in the arse, you know, like it was a system put together by Gough Whitlam in 1975. Gough Whitlam was one of the idealistic generation of university students in Australia who interrupted their studies to volunteer and go and fight World War II to make the world a better place. Gough was a navigator in the RAAF flying Lockheed Hudsons against the Japanese, so he had a very, very dangerous war. I don't know how often he would have been shot at, but there was always an excellent chance of an engine failure far out over the bloody ocean in a twin engine heap of shit that wouldn't fly for very far on one engine. If God was agreeable and the Pope thought it was a nice idea, a lightly loaded Lockheed Hudson with half fuel could maintain height on one engine. But if you wanted to go fast, to run away from anybody, you might have shot out the engine that's not working, then yeah, you had to go downhill. Anyway, one of Gough's things was that he wanted people in Australia who were on the dole or the pension, or they were low income wage earners. He wanted them and their family, their wives and their kids, or their husband and their kids. He wanted them to be able to go to the doctor when they were sick for free. And if the doctor said you need to go to hospital, he wanted that to be free too. He didn't want any of this bullshit about private patients and public patients getting treated for free on charity and shit. No, he wanted a systematised bureaucracy which took 1% of income tax of everybody who had a job and funded the healthcare system with it. And it worked really well until the bloody Australian Medical Association and the people who want to ape the American system, they said, oh, but we don't want to work for the government. That's communism. We want to have a private system. But they don't want the people who go to private hospitals to have to pay the whole bill. If you want to have a private hospital system, great. Go to the private system, no Medicare. If there's no Medicare payment to the private system, all of a sudden nobody can fucking afford to go there and it all falls to bits and then all those doctors come and ask for a job in the Medicare system. That's why they demand that they get full Medicare payment for everybody that they treat in the private system, and then they want more money on top of that. Same with private schools. If you want to send your kid to a private school, I have no objection to that at all. But why should the public school do with less funding because the pricks who want to send their kid to an expensive private school demand as much funding for their kids from the public system as the kids at the public school get? Fuck that. If you think the public school system's not good enough for you, if you want the private system, great. Send your kid to a private school and you pay everything. The state pays you nothing because you think you're too fucking good to go to a state school. You think your kids are too good for a state school. Fuck off. Get out of here. Right? I did 6 years at two different Catholic boarding schools, and I'm afraid I picked up a whole lot of morals and ethics and principles and ideas on what's the correct thing to do, which if I had never gone to a Catholic school, I probably would never have thought about. So there is that. It wasn't fun. I was a lapsed Presbyterian when I got sent there. Hadn't been to Sunday school for 6 years when I was 11. But I do understand what the idea of do unto others as you want them to do unto you means. That means if you don't want to be ripped off, don't fucking rip anybody off. If you don't want to be stolen from, don't fucking steal. If you don't want to be fucking attacked and murdered, don't attack people and don't murder them. If you don't want to be raped, don't rape. It's really fucking simple. I have no idea what the exact mechanics are of however the system of infinitely fractal karmic feedback loops within the cosmic scoreboard effect are administered, but I have absolute ultimate faith in the fact that we live in a fair universe and we live in the best of all possible universes, allowing for the downstream cascading consequences of every decision freely made by every person who's ever lived before we get on the scene. There is no way that Keith and Mari Burns were free to live their lives as Ngurrabal Aborigines because somebody else made the decision hundreds of years before they were born for a bunch of Europeans with no fucking idea how to live in Australia to come out here and colonise the place at gunpoint. They did the best with what they had to work with. At no time could they or I make a decision to choose to go to the zoo and look at a dodo. Why not? Because some self-centered Dutch asshole ate the last one 400 fucking years ago. On their way to the fucking East Indies to steal the spice from the people who lived there, because that's the European way. The Dutch East Indies Corporation was the first limited liability public corporation on the history of the planet. And nothing that's ever happened to Holland has been bad enough to fucking repay those assholes for what they did. You think the poor fucking Belgians, oh, the First World War ran over their country, oh, the Second World War ran over their country. Have a look at fucking Belgian Congo, Prince Leopold, King Leopold's Congo. Nothing that happened to Belgium in the First and Second World War has sufficiently repaid those fucking assholes for what they did to Africa in their great-grandparents' time. Because the sins of the fathers, the sins of the mothers, the sins of the parents are visited onto the children, even unto the seventh generation. Yeah? And that's what these fucking racist white cunts are trying to celebrate. Australia Day! Australia Day? Fuck off. No wonder I used to hang around with the Aboriginal tribal elders 30 fucking years ago before I come up here to live on the Endangered Species Sanctuary. It really is. It's fucking sad. By Joves, I do get carried away when I start thinking about it, don't I, Auntie Mari? Anyway, time for another one. Suppose I better get back to the yarn of how I met Mari and Keith. I went into the Land Council and I excused myself for interrupting them. And they looked at me like I was a little green man from Mars, I suppose. You know, I mean, they knew I'd grown up in Glen Innes. They knew my father was a bloody engine reconditioner and a school bus driver. They knew my mother was a school teacher, and therefore they expected me to be a ignorant, arrogant white prick. Just, you know, statistically speaking. Anyway, they asked me what they could do for me, and I said, well, I've paid this money for a title deed, 100 acres. And the post office tells me that I've got to tell them the name of the property so they know where to deliver the mail when people write to me. They're looking at me and nodding. And I said, so it occurs to me that I was raised here. I was born in Sydney, but I was raised in the town. I don't know what the name of that ridge is. People have been living on this part of Australia for at least 40,000 years. It'd be nice. It'd be the right thing to do. It'd be the least I could do if I can find out what the original name of the place is, and then I can give the land its name back. And they just looked blank. They had no fucking idea. Why would you want to do that, they said. And I said, because anything else would be fucking rude, wouldn't it? And again, they looked at me like I was a little green man from Mars. And one of them said, well, where is this place you bought? And I told them. And they looked at each other and they said, well, Yarraford, that's out near where Keith and Mari Burns used to live back when they were young. How about we give you their phone number? So they did. I went down to the local public phone booth because in them days I didn't have a phone up here. And I rung up and I got on to Mrs. Burns and I explained it all to her. And Well, part of the reason I get emotional, she burst into tears at me. She would have been, I don't know, must have been 60, my age now. I suppose she was 92 when she died, and I'm 62 now. Am I 61? Turning 62. Yeah. Anyway, nobody had ever asked her that. No white man had ever asked her how they could go about giving Australia a bit of Australia its name back. And for a while, we had a theory where Keith might come out here and camp on the place and see if he could try and fucking dream up the name. And a lot of people would say that's a bullshit idea. I don't know that it is. I do not know that it is. For the following reason, I've made a bit of a study of comparative theology, and one of the more impressive theologies I've come across, it holds the theory that if you've had children, then when you die, your spirit soul is tied to the lowest heaven of the earth so that you're going to be able to inspire your descendants with what you think is going to be a helpful bit of advice. Nudge them in your idea of a good direction for 7 generations of your descendants. So what that would mean is that at this point in time, there should be at least 7 generations of Aboriginal ancestors whose soul is not trapped so much as held in the first and lowest heaven of the earth, specifically so that they can inspire their descendants toward the right thing to do. So if somebody with any Aboriginal heritage is to sleep on the ground on Aboriginal land, then the more native wildlife, both plant and animal, there is around them, the deeper and richer the ecology, the more likely they are to wake up inspired to do stuff that just seems like the right thing to them. And when they do it, they're going to fall back into the olden ways, is what I'm saying. You know, I don't know whether I've got any blackfella in me or not. I got to say, now that my mother's dead, I don't mind telling you that Keith Byrne there spent 25 years hinting that he knew that I was a secret Aborigine parson for white, but he thought it was on my father's side because he went to school with Aboriginal Whartons who lived at Emmaville. I don't think he's right, but Mari Burns, she told me my mother's father's name of Cruz from Kempsey is a very well-known Aboriginal name down around Kempsey. And I must admit that despite the fact that in August 1917 my mother's father was awarded International Aviator Certificate number 96 by the Royal Australian Aero Club under the auspices of the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale on the 3rd of January 1918 when he attempted to enlist in the Australian Flying Corps, showing his pilot's licence and describing his profession as aviator. He was 25 years old and he'd paid for flying lessons at a civilian flying school, working as a mechanic to get the money. They recruited him as a sergeant mechanic because he looked like he had too much of a touch of the tar brush. And it took him till August 1918 in England before he could get anybody to actually pay attention to the fact that he had a pilot's licence. And they sent him to the Australian Flying Corps training squadrons on Salisbury Plain, and he finished his training because Lloyd George wanted to send Australian Sopwith camels to Crimea to fight the Bolsheviks, and therefore after World War One finished, Australia's student pilots in the Australian Flying Corps completed their training, and they were taken to Buckingham Palace, and the King of England pinned my grandfather's wings on his chest and gave him his commission as a lieutenant in the Australian Flying Corps, 19th of March, 1919. And then Billy Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister, he said, Lloyd George, take that idea of Australians taking Sopwith camels to the Crimea to fight the Bolsheviks and shove it up your ass. And Billy Hughes announced a £10,000 prize for the first Australian crew of airmen to fly in a British machine from England to Australia. And Ross and Keith Smith won that prize in a Vickers Vimy registered GEAOU. God help all of us. That's their joke. So anyway, commissioned a lieutenant in the Australian Flying Corps, not getting sent to shoot the communists. My grandfather gets on the boat and comes back to Australia. And then he had 6 months leave on full pay, and then on Christmas Eve, 1919, they demobilised him. So he had, 12 or 20 hours in his logbook, total time. About the same as me, actually. I've actually done more flying than him, though, because I've done more variety. But anyway, that's what inspired me to be a bloody Biggles fanatic. And I don't know. It's possible that if I'm right, the reason that he got shit canned as a pilot when he applied to the Australian Flying Corps in 1918, if they thought he was a blackfella, that was just after the second citizenship referendum. There was one in about 1916, might have been 1915, where Billy Hughes wanted Australia to be able to conscript people to go and fight in England's wars, and the population of Australia voted him down, told him to piss off. And the Australian Imperial Forces were not getting as many volunteers as they were getting casualties, and things were getting pretty grim. And Billy Hughes ran his conscription referendum again, and he lost again. And before his second lost conscription referendum, it was illegal to recruit Aborigines in the Australian Imperial Force. After he lost his second conscription referendum, that's when they said, yeah, you can recruit Aborigines. In fact, if you can recruit 100 Aborigines, we'll give you a silver boomerang. That's what they said to the recruiters. That's when a lot of the Australian Aborigines who came home from the First World War and then had tell stories of incredible bitterness because they were excluded from all the veterans programs because they weren't citizens, so they were fucking wildlife with the kangaroos and the emus. But anyway, my grandfather come home and he got to marry a rich man's daughter, but that's a different story. what I'm told is that in 1917, my grandmother said that she couldn't possibly marry him because of social differences. The way it was put to me was that he didn't finish high school and she was a rich man's daughter. Her father was connected to his father, who started the Orange Lodge in Sydney after coming out from Ireland. He was a real right-wing Protestant loyalist prick, actually. But anyway, my grandmother wouldn't marry my grandfather, and she told me this when I was about 3 or 4. I've never fucking forgotten it. It was just after he died. She said she told him she couldn't possibly marry him unless he joined the Australian Imperial Forces and went away and fought in the war and came home an officer and a gentleman, because then her family could not object. Now, she was either a very clever, cunning lady, or she was an absolute vicious, bloodthirsty fucking bitch. But I do know that I told my son when he was a child, if ever any woman tells you that she's not going to fuck you unless you go and kill a stranger for pay, I want you to turn around and run as far and as fast away from her and all her family as you can possibly fucking get, kid. And, well, I used to sell helicopter joyrides. My son was a foundation member for the remote area firefighting team. He used to winch launch out of a helicopter at 300 feet over the forest to light a backburn. He was telling me last week he did 3 days firefighting, and the week before that he took a strike team over to Bundarra, and when he got there they said, oh, thank God you're here. You can be fire controller for the night. So his strike team went out and they did their thing, and he got to stay and sit at the desk. But he got to control a Chinook, a fucking RAAF Chinook dropping 10 tons of water at a time. They don't give him the gun. When he goes out there playing at firefighting, my son doesn't shoot anybody. Nobody shoots at him. I've I have evolved a family bloodline. On my side, my grandfather was a mercenary wanting to fly for the British King. On my wife's side, her father was a fucking Fallschirmjäger in the Hungarian Air Force, seconded, well, he was a tail gunner in the Hungarian Air Force, seconded to the Luftwaffe. And they turned him into a Fallschirmjäger. So, yeah, my son's grandfather on one side, my father, he was a civilian who figured out a better way to make machine guns for the Lithgow Small Arms Factory. And on his mother's side, his grandfather was a fucking parachute attack trooper for Hitler. I gotta say, me having been in high school cadets, nursing 2,000 veterans of every fucking military adventure Australia was involved in from 1914 to 1984, and I did that over 3 years. 10 days per veteran, worked it out one night. A long, slow, boring night duty, and I wondered how many veterans I'd nursed, and I figured it out on the basis of I normally had 8 patients per 8-hour shift, and on night shifts I had 16. And yeah, I worked it out, 2,000 veterans for 10 days each, and they turned me from a full-on true believer in the Anzac legend and a Biggles fetishist to boot. They turned me into a pacifist, somebody who recognises that all war is always all bullshit. Total fucking bullshit. Not so much in their words, but the phenomenon is best expressed partly by my father-in-law. But the nub of it is, if you look at the movies Catch-22 and the Battle of Britain, 20 years after they stop shooting at each other, the veterans on both sides of every conflict begin to encounter each other in social situations. They're travelling in another city and they bump in an airport or something. They start talking to one another and they swap addresses. They start writing to one another. 20 years after the Battle of Britain was when Adolf Galland and Douglas Bader started getting together to advise how to make the film Battle of Britain. And then they start having meetups and reunions, and they start bringing their wives, and they start bringing their children, they start bringing their grandchildren. In 20, 45, 55, 65, 75, 85, 95, yeah, in 1995, the US Army Air Corps 8th Air Force aircrew veterans and the Luftwaffe Flak Division and the Luftwaffe Jagdwaffe pilots, they all got together for a Rhine River barge cruise with their wives and their children and grandchildren, and they went off celebrating the anniversary of Big Week in 1943, which was the fucking 8th Air Force's worst ever casualty week. Yeah? In 2012, I think it was. Yeah, 2012. The American Strategic Air Command aircrew and the Navy pilots who had also been flying in Operation Linebacker, the Christmas bombings of Hanoi in 1972. The B-52 aircrews and the Navy wild, what are they called, wild weasels? Yeah, the electronics countermeasures aircraft. They all met up in Hanoi at the American War Memorial, because that's what the Vietnamese call their war memorial, it's the memorial to the American War, and sitting around the tail section of a B-52 that was shot down into a lake, they had a dinner dance with the surface-to-air missile crews and the Vietnamese Air Force MiG pilots, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 40th anniversary of the Christmas bombing of Hanoi. And like I remember the Christmas bombings of Hanoi. I remember coming home with a newspaper that said Nixon was ready to drop N bombs in Nam. He was actually going to drop them in Laos, I think, but Cambodia perhaps. No, Laos. Yeah. Eventually, all the people who were doing the actual shooting at each other, they figure out it's bullshit, and they gather together to swap stories and compare notes about how they were led astray by their parents and their teachers and their scoutmasters and the newspaper and magazine and radio editors and producers and the writers and their neighbours and their clergy. And then they got put through a basic training system where they were depersonalised and then they were repersonalised to think that the people in their unit were their family. So when they got in a situation where they could see the elephant and the shit was hitting the fan and the metal was flying, the one thing they didn't want to do was to be seen to let their comrades down. Not fucking one of them fought for their flag. Not fucking one of them fought for their leader. Not fucking one of them fought for their mother. Not fucking one of them fought for their country. Every one of them fought so they could say to themselves that they had not let down their mates. On every side. On every side. And here we are in Australia. 235 years after the fucking sheep and potato invasion. They've just rebuilt the fucking war memorial in Canberra. Paying homage to every military adventure Australia ever took part in. From the fucking siege of Khartoum and the Maori Wars, the Boer War, World War One. They backpedal the Spanish Civil War because the Australians who fought in the Spanish Civil War were all communists fighting on the side of the International Brigade. But I've nursed them. I've nursed Australian Spanish Civil War communist veterans. And then there was the fucking Great War of One and the Great War of Two and fucking Korea and Vietnam. And then, Jesus Christ, we thought we'd fucking got over it with Vietnam. We thought they'd all woken up to themselves. I remember marching in the moratorium against the Vietnam War. You know, like the Paris Spring of 1968 was pretty good. Tet Offensive was fucking great. I loved it. Fucking American Marines fighting their way into the American embassy. The fucking Saigon chief of police summarily executing a suspect on the street. No trial, no prosecution, no evidence. Hearsay. He was told this person was captured near where a bomb had gone off. Pulled out a fucking pistol and shot him on the TV in front of me. Yeah, man. We learned. And we thought everybody had learned. We, the space cadet generation, we thought everybody had learned. We, the people who are not boomers. You know, when I first heard the term boomer, I was in kindergarten. They said to me when I was in kindergarten, "You are not a boomer. You are too young to be a boomer." Boomers were born in the 10 years following World War II. They weren't actually. They were only born in the first 5 years, maybe 6. The story is, after victory in Europe Day, there was a drunken street orgy And everybody in the British Empire and America fucked whoever they could find. We're not going to die. The war's over. And then everybody who'd been postponing having a family because they might have to go and die in a far-flung foreign land, they went home and they started their family. And then the Americans nuked Japan because they were about to surrender because the mining campaign in the Sea of Japan had meant they were starving and they were afraid of the Russians attacking them. So the Japanese surrendered, and in the whole British Empire, American Empire, there was another street orgy 6 months later. So 9 months after Hitler shot himself and 9 months after they bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's when the baby boomers commenced to be born. And there was a factual statistical spike in baby birth in all of those countries. That was the baby boom. 1950, the Korean War started. And all of a sudden, all the unemployed veterans who couldn't fucking make a go of it in peacetime, they'd run out their veterans' benefits at the university or the college or whatever it was, and they were still drunk and despondent and depressed in a trailer. The pilots were okay, the aircrew were okay, because they'd had the Berlin airlift. They'd had 2 years of work from 1948 onwards. Then the Korean War kicked off, and all the people on the reserve list were reactivated. And they stopped fucking, and they stopped breeding. And the baby boom tapered off. Oops, sorry, I'm looking from the wrong side. The baby boom tapered off. So the tabloid journalists, they wanted the baby boom to run for 10 years at that point. So they said the baby boom went from 1946 to 1956. And what happened in 1956? The Suez Canal crisis. So the baby boom went from Hitler shooting himself to Britain and France getting kicked out of Egypt. The baby boom ended before Sputnik in 1957. The baby boom, I was told in kindergarten, is not a, quote, generation, unquote. ... exclamation mark, underline. A generation is 15 years, you see, because 10-year-olds don't get pregnant and make another generation. 15-year-olds do. So a generation is 15 years. The first time any human, quote, generation was named, designated a generation, was 1930 to 1945, the silent generation. The kids who grew up during the Great Depression and the Great War of Two. Then there was the baby boomers, who were not a generation, they were, quote, a decadal phenomenon. And after the baby boomers, then there was me and my mob. 1957 to 1972, the Space Cadets. Sputnik to the very last Apollo. We were the Space Cadets. And then, after the Space Cadets, that's when they started talking about generation fucking X, Y, Z, millennials, all these other fucking competing labels and brand designations and marketing opportunities. And somewhere along the way, some half-assed, city-bred, brainless fucking sociologist, perhaps, more likely a tabloid journalist, they decided that this was getting all a bit inconvenient. Why don't we just magically extend the date of where the baby boomers died from, or stopped being born, from 1956 to 1965? And then some other fucking prick said, oh, well, let's call 45 to 65 early baby boom, or maybe it's 45 to 60, early baby boom, and then 65 to 75, that can be the late baby, or 60 to 75, that's the late baby boom. And all the people concerned, we were all busy fucking working. doing whatever was happening. It was a bunch of fucking calcified academics and wet behind the ears neophytes who made these decisions. And now I'm confronted with fucking kids younger than mine who tell me that I'm a baby boomer. No, I'm not. I'm a space cadet! And I was raised to be a white fella in a small country town, and the training didn't take. And maybe I'm a little bit secret part black fella, but I don't know. I've never been paid to be a black fella. But I carve a good boomerang. I'm pretty good at finding carved trees and carved stones. And I've given all the land that I can afford to look after half my lifetime. Fallow. Recovering. And I tried to give this land its name back. And it didn't sort of work. What actually happened? Now, here's another bloody story. I'm sorry about the segue. This is a good one. Me and a bloke I used to be friends with, he had a two-seat 95.10 ultralight, and that's a fucking oxymoronic contradiction in terms because 95.10 ultralights are, by definition, single seat. But he had the prototype Bailey Moyes Dragonfly, which was designed for towing hang gliders, and therefore it had a luggage rack with seatbelts so that training and instruction of new tow pilots could occur. So he had a two-seat slash single-seat ultralight designed for towing hang gliders, and we were at Drake, and we were towing hang gliders, and my mate, the pilot, he was wearing a full-face helmet, and there was a really, really, really old, dead, hollow tree, and he wanted to pee, and he went over the taxied his plane after landing over to the tree, and he got out, shut the motor down, got out of it, and he walked over to the tree, and I saw him. He looked to his right, and he looked to his left, and he couldn't see anyone, and he had a piss against the tree. And before he'd zipped his fly up, an old Aboriginal woman ran out there, and she was fucking waving her arms and yelling and telling him what an asshole he was. And I knew he was a sort of a bit of a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist who wasn't going to take very kindly to any of this, but he was a mate of mine. I'd been flying with him for fucking decades, you know. So I went over and I said, what's the sort of problem? And the lady concerned, her name was Una Walker. And if you know anything at all about Aboriginal politics in northern New South Wales, you know she was a very big gun. So I knew who she was. Old mate didn't. And she's on a high horse and she's got a dander up and she's huffing and puffing, see. So she tells me that her problem is that she's an Aboriginal woman and he's a white man. And it's broad daylight in a public place. And he's just got out of his flying machine and walked over there and pulled his cock out and he's pissed in front of her. And her point is, if any Aboriginal man did that in front of any white woman, the police would be called and he would be beaten up and manhandled and handcuffed and taken to bloody hold in the cells. And then he'd go in front of a magistrate and he'd be lucky not to get 3 months in jail for indecent exposure. And therefore she was huffing and puffing at old mate the ultralight pilot. Not because she saw his dick, because I watched her, she was behind him. It was the principle of the thing. It was the fact that she thought he didn't respect her enough to not piss in front of her. And I pointed out to her, well, I fully understand where you're coming from, and you're exactly right. If an Aboriginal man pulled out his dick and pissed in front of a white woman in a public place, he could expect to be treated very badly by the police, who would be white, overwhelmingly white police in Australia. I said, but here's the problem, Mrs. Walker. He was wearing a full-face helmet. He was looking at the tree. I was standing behind the aeroplane. You were over there on the right-hand side. We both saw him walk over to the tree. We both saw him turn his head to the right. We both saw him turn his head to the left. He's got a window, like it's right around here. He turns his head to the left. He can't see anything behind him. He turns his head to the right. He can't see anything behind him. You were behind him. I was behind him. He didn't see you. He didn't piss in front of an Aboriginal woman. He went up to a tree so no one could see his dick from the front of him, and he looked both sides to make sure no one was watching him. He did the best that he could. He just didn't know you were there. When I put it to her in those terms, Mrs. Walker thought, fair enough, you're right. And she introduced me to her husband, and we talked a bit, and I explained how I live and how I think, and what they said to me was, well, you're doing a good job, and if you want to feel like you're doing something to redress the balance against white colonisation, think of yourself as renting that 100 acres you're looking after. We won't tell you what to do with it, but you try and do something every year to pay the rent on the Aboriginal land that you're looking after and you're living on. And that'd be an improvement on what most white fellas are doing. So yeah, I did that. And they said, what can we do for you? And I told them my problem with the name of the place and how I'd talked to the local land council. They sent me to Keith and Murray, and they didn't grow up around here. They were working. Keith was fencing when he was working on Rangers Valley Station, which is like 15 k's down the road. They had no fucking idea what this place was called, but they were impressed that I was looking. They were impressed that I was trying. And Eric Walker said, well, what are your ideas on the place? Asking me. And I said, I would have wanted to call it Eagle Dreaming, and I wanted to know how to call it that in Aboriginal talk. And he said, well, are there lots of eagles there? I said, no. And he said, okay, well, you better not call it that because that'll be bullshit for a start. Fair point, eh? And he said, what is the biggest bird? You know, you're a bloody aeroplane freak. You're obviously the birds and flying things. What's the biggest bird that hangs around there? And I said, the yellow-tailed black cockatoo. And he said, well, we call them a waylard. He says, waylard means yellow-tailed black cockatoo. And he's highland Bundjalung. It's sort of one of the Taoris or tribal homelands that adjoins LongWarbleRant. And I said, well, I got carved Currajongs up there, so I'd like that to be in the name as well. I said, what about a dreaming place? You know, a yellow-tailed black cockatoo, tree of life dreaming place. He says, well, a dreaming place is a Budgerall Dune. So that's why this place is called Waylard Currajong Budgerall Dune. And there's a poem about it, and it's in the book, and it's in the bloody Warbles in the Wilderness playlist, and this movie's long enough, and I'm not going to recite the poem. You can go to the playlist and you can find the poem. It's a pretty good one. Only 3 verses long. But anyway, that's how this place got the name that it has been known under for 30 years. Well, no, probably only 25, because for 5 or 7 years I didn't know what to call it. And now we've actually got wedge-tails that camp on the ridge and hunt in the valley. So we're getting closer. We've still got the waylards. And occasionally when the waylards fly over and I hear them calling to each other, and I yell at them. And I yell at them in palm cockatoo talk. Because the palm cockatoos, they say, hello, hello. That sounds just like a person. The first time I did it, I was watching. There's this yellow-tailed black cockatoo was flying over, and it's going, Willard, Willard. And I yelled out, hello, hello. And it did a fucking half roll to look down and see it was only me. And it turned back the right way up and flew on. It was great. I quite enjoy interacting with the wildlife. So anyway, yeah, after they met the weird fucking white man living on 100 acres carving boomerangs and magic spell enhancers and playing with didgeridoos and feeding the bloody kangaroos. Yeah, Keith and Murray kept me as the sort of friend they would wave to when they saw me in the streets, and we'd go over and we'd have a bit of a talk. And when I wanted permission to make and carve and paint boomerangs, I went and talked to Keith and Murray and Pat and Dick Lord and Rita Lord. And well, it wasn't actually Keith who said it. It was Pat Lord who said it. He said, if you want to explain Aboriginal technologies to the white fellas, that would have to make an improvement. And I don't know whether it was him or whether it was Keith, but about the time Michael Mansell wanted to get some hand grenades from fucking Muammar Gaddafi so that he could blow up the bicentennial genocide party in 1988, I'd gone down to the bloody land council and talked to a few of the old people to see whether it was anything that could be headed off the pass. And at that point, I'd been living 5 miles from the nearest other person in an abandoned farmhouse with an open fire and a kerosene light and the radio. And I'd been listening to a lot of the programs on ABC Radio National talking about Aboriginal issues. And I'd heard that a lot of Aborigines found it offensive that they'd be walking down the street and no white man would ever meet their eye or say good day, no white person. And I thought, well, they're right. I don't generally say good day to Aborigines when I meet them because I don't know them. And I decided, if I'm going to live on their fucking land, I better at least say good day to them, acknowledge their presence when I encounter them. So I started nodding and saying good day when I met Aborigines in the street. And 3 years later, one of them noticed. Because they'd all been so fucking conditioned by how rude the white population were, that every time an Aborigine was walking down the streets of an inland country town like Glen Innes, they'd see a white prick like me coming towards them, and before I could snub them, they would find something really interesting to look at in the shop window as I walked past. So they would not get to see me look away. And it meant that for 3 years, as I waited for a polite distance, and as I got close to them, I'd say, "G'day, how you going?" And I'd be saying it to their fucking right ear hole. 3 years, 3 years before an Aborigine noticed that I was actually saying good day to them, because they didn't expect it, because I'm a white man. Because I'm a white man, the Aborigines did not expect me to condescend to deign to lower myself enough to say good day. What does that say about white Australia? When I get tarred with the fucking brush of white Australia, I find it hurtful, shameful, offensive, painful. I fucking hate it. I don't want to be thought of as a white Australian because I know what they've done. So yeah, I didn't know Chris Burns, Dale Byrne come out here. I took him over and showed him my bloody carved Currajong tree. Showed him how all this place works. Took him out to Tent Hill. Showed him the carved stone I found on a mountain and the Currajong trees over there. And yeah, for 20 odd years, I got along really well with the Aborigines. And I've got to say, all the older people that I knew are dead. And that's just part of the fucking genocide that colonial Europeans have done to Australia. Aborigines don't make old bones. Maori was 92. 92. Keith was about fucking 86 or something when he died. Anyway, how about we have a look, before I end this video, at the latest little bit of documentation. This year's contribution to what I have learned Surviving New England by, I think it's Callum Clayton Dixon. Whereas the biggest estate on earth and Blood on the Wattle, they both look at the entire nation. And whereas Baal Belbora looks at the New England and the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Surviving New England is just particularly the New England tablelands of New South Wales, and it's written by a bloke who lives at Uralla, or grew up around Uralla, and therefore it's basically Uralla to Ben Lomond, which is about 50 kilometres south of here. So this doesn't actually cover the country that I live on, but it's as close as I've been able to find without going to a coarse-grained all of New England plus all of the mid-north coast, the biggest estate on earth, blood on the wattle, kind of sort of thing. Okay. Callum Clayton Dixon is an Aboriginal linguist and historian whose people come from the southern end of the New England tableland, New South Wales, around Walker, Woolbrook and the Ingle Bar Reserve, Ambiyang country. He lives in Armidale on Aniwan country and is spearheading efforts to revive the long-dormant local language. Callum is currently undertaking a PhD project to develop a dictionary and grammar for his ancestral tongue. Fucking yay team, mate. History of Aboriginal resistance and resilience through the first 40 years of the colonial apocalypse. Now, how about we just have a bit of a look at the illustrations? Callum's grandfather and uncle, Ambiyang country. Callum's grandfather, grandfather's cousin, Jack Moses, Callum and his grandfather. Exemption certificate for an Aboriginal lady. Clara Boney Nee Pacey's Aboriginal Welfare Board files regarding the issuing of her exemption certificate. It means she doesn't have to live on the mission. Map of tribes and languages belonging to the southern half of New England tablelands. Now, Tingha, Ben Lomond, Oban, Guyra, Bundara, Armidale, Kingston, Hillgrove, Ebor, Uralla, Bendemeer, Moombi, Walker, Yarrowitch, Nowandok. Right, well, Ben Lomond's 50 kilometres south of here, and I live up about there. So, yeah, sorry I'm not in this. But my grandfather was born in 1885 at Bundara, and he grew up at Armidale. And he left school as a teenager, so about 1910. No, hang on. 1885, 1900. About 1900, he left his father's roof to be an apprentice wheelwright in Armidale, and he did most of his work between bloody Armidale and Glen Innes. And my grandmother come from Tingha, and he used to ride a bloody bicycle from Glen Innes to Tingha at the turn of the century. The squatting invasion begins. It wasn't until 1832, 14 years after Oxley's expedition, that Hamilton Collins Sempill drove his sheep onto the tableland and formed Walker Station, commencing the squatting invasion of this region. With the removal of stock from the low country estates to the district of New England, the sprawl of pastoral stations began, heralding a period of intense and unchecked frontier violence. A government report of 1839 justifying the maintenance of a large police force in New South Wales made reference to, among other motivating factors, quote, collisions, unquote, between Aboriginal people and the Euro-Peon population, particularly of late years. In evidence to the New South Wales Legislative Council, Sempill attested that upon first contact with colonists, New England Aborigines were, quote, invariably hostile, unquote. They were understandably wary of these strange newcomers as well. In 1835, a group of settlers set out in search of lands, quote, for the purpose of forming stations north of the McDonald River, venturing as far as Chandler's Peak, east of where the town of Guyra now stands. During the course of their journey, they observed the signal fires of the natives during the day, denoting the arrival of whites, and on their advance found the remains of fires. They, however, met with no interruption from the natives, who kept out of sight or at a distance. Asserting that by the time of his arrival on the tableland in 1852, quote, the dark chapter had been closed in that district, unquote, Albert Norton stated that, quote, those who were the first to occupy the country were by no means free from dangers of attacks by the blacks, end quote. Whilst distancing himself from the original scourge of frontier violence, Norton acknowledged the prevalence and brutality of the conflict, quote, I never took part in the scrimmages, to use a mild term, of which I have heard very much, and it gives me only pain to recall the scenes which others have described to me. As I said recently in telephone conversations, my brother, who's now 81, 82, he tells me that between what my father and my grandfather told him, he knows most of the stories of most of the massacres that happened around Beginneth. I hope to get him to come and pass those on to me so I can pass them on to my kids before time and tide catches up with my brother, who's 20 years older than me. I'm a 1961 edition, who's a 1941. However, that's a minor digression. Records of initial hostilities on the tablelands are scant, but a number of articles appearing in newspapers from 1836 make reference to the warfare labelled as, quote, outrages waged by Aborigines in the newly discovered country northeast of the Liverpool Plains, unquote, reported to, quote, have lately speared both men and cattle, unquote. The Aboriginal people of New England were said to be, quote, very troublesome, unquote, of, quote, murderous disposition, unquote, and noted for their treachery, unquote. Defensive Aboriginal action inevitably provoked retaliation. In addition to settlers and convicts making indiscriminate reprisals on the natives, unquote, there were also attacks sanctioned and perpetrated by government agents. In February 1838, Lieutenant George Cobban led, quote, a large body of, unquote, of mounted police up from the Peel River, that's Tamworth, onto the tableland. According to an article in the Sydney Gazette, the expedition aimed, quote, to employ coercive measures, unquote, against local Aboriginal people whose armed resistance efforts had, quote, at length roused the attention of the government, unquote. Defending their lands and lives against the onslaught of British invasion and occupation, Aboriginal warriors were appropriating and destroying livestock and killing station workers. Cobban spent several weeks scouring southern New England for the killers of two shepherds in the service of the Allman brothers of Yarrowitch Station and another working for Frederick Cruikshanks on the Mehigh Creek Run. The shepherds had been attacked whilst out in the bush, and their flocks were seized because the fucking sheep had eaten all the food plants and driven off all the prey animals, and the Aborigines were starving, and therefore the Aborigines took the fucking sheep for food. In the course of his search, the lieutenant found that Aborigines had also raided a depot formed by surveyor Hereinat Finch. Warriors reportedly, quote, came down in great numbers, unquote, tomahawked Finch's two assigned servants, and sacked the stores they'd been left to watch over. The servants' bodies were located in a nearby waterway, possibly Surveyor's Creek. The assailants were eventually tracked down and ambushed at their camp, apparently not too far from Finch's depot. This was only possible, however, thanks to intelligence extracted from their kin, quote, by threats and the promise of rewards, unquote, and to the help of an Aboriginal guide co-opted into the search. Cobban and his troops came in view and charged them and succeeded in taking the whole party, unquote, two of whom were shot and killed in the attack. One of the fallen, Henry, was subsequently decapitated, his head impaled on a stake in the stockyard. Two others, Jackie and Baramble, were marched down to Port Macquarie for committal and then to Sydney to face trial. Although officially deemed as criminals by the colonial authorities, they were effectively prisoners taken in an undeclared war. And of course, The fucking Anzac legend never mentioned mud and lust and gore. Actually defending Australia against fucking foreign invaders, did it, eh? Not until 1942, when the Japanese bombed Darwin. Although there were offensive patrols undertaken from Point Cook in Melbourne against suspected German submarines in Port Phillip Bay in the 1914-18 war. But yeah, the war memorial's absolutely chock full of all the fucking heroic glory of Australia trying to invade Turkey in 1915. Because let's see if we can get this right. A Serbo-Croatian shot an Austro-Hungarian in a town called Sarajevo. Therefore, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Serbia was allied to Russia. Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was allied to Germany. Germany declared war on Russia. Russia was allied to England and France. England and France declared war on Germany. Germany was allied through the Austro-Hungarians to the Ottoman Turkish Caliphate. Therefore, Turkey declared war on the British Empire. And as a direct result, on New Year's Day, January 1915, two Afghan expatriates wearing hand-sewn Turkish army uniforms under a hand-sewn Turkish flag used their Morse K-98s to attack the Menindee Lakes picnic train. Open carriages full of civilians. Their first shot killed a 17-year-old girl in the Battle of Silver Hill. And as a result, 7 people were shot, 7 people were wounded, 5 people died. The mosque was burned to the ground at Broken Hill. And there was absolutely no difficulty at all whatsoever in recruiting Australians to go and invade Turkey at Gallipoli, at Anzac Cove in 1915. Everybody in Australia was totally fucking pissed off at what the Turkeys had done at Menindee Lakes on New Year's Day. Rule Britannia. Funny that, isn't it? The war memorial's full of that shit. Running uphill into machine gun fire, through the mortar rounds, getting shot at by rifles, over barbed wire, for 9 months, up a cliff, backs to the sea. But when we have Aborigines trying to defend their fucking ancestral homelands where they've been living for 40,000 years at a minimum against a bunch of fucking ignorant, hubristic, arrogant arseholes who didn't know their arse from a hole in the ground, couldn't tell you whether the hole in their bum was punchboard or cut with a coal chisel. Everything they touched, they fucked. Oh no, the War Memorial in Canberra can't tell you the story of the Aboriginal defence of their homeland because we white cunts were the invaders. And that might upset pricks like Peter Dutton and Barney Baby Joyce, the fucking Kiwi, secret Kiwi, who got kicked out of the Australian Parliament because he broke the fucking laws against dual cities and shit. There was likely to have been more to the lieutenant's activities than he reported to his superiors. Historian Roger Millis points out that much of the time that Cobban had spent on the tableland was, quote, virtually unaccounted for, unquote, intimating that he may have been engaged in additional unsanctioned hostilities. The Sydney Gazette also documented how vigilantes carried on Cobban's punitive actions following his departure from the region. Several of the natives have since been shot by, quote, several of the natives have since been shot by the whites, who have been for some time past out in search of the murderers. Arriving in New England a year later, George James MacDonald, the district's inaugural Commissioner of Crown Lands, found there to be, quote, a general and pervading terror of the mounted police, quote, end quote, among the tableland's Aboriginal population, quote, a feeling instilled probably at some former period from having been pursued by them, unquote. Such comments are a glimpse into the lasting ramifications of Cobban's dealings with New England Aborigines in 1838, which clearly played a significant role in establishing a reign of fear and oppression over them and their descendants. The expedition took place just a few months before the infamous massacre at Myall Creek, where a posse of 12 stockmen brutally murdered 28 Aboriginal people, women, children and old men. After a second trial, 7 of the perpetrators were found guilty and they were hanged for their crimes. Questioning what he saw as a double standard exercised by the government of New South Wales, parliamentarian Stuart Donaldson pointed out that George Cobban, quote, had slaughtered the blacks as cruelly as the men who were executed, unquote. Rather than being brought to trial and punished accordingly, the lieutenant was merely transferred to a post in another district. The lives of 7 convicts and ex-convicts were essentially expendable, the spectacle made of them contributing to the facade of an ostensibly more progressive and humane version of colonialism. Meanwhile, the violent exploits of government-sanctioned operatives like Cobban were evidently exempt from prosecution. The death, destruction and whatever, quote, collateral damage, unquote, that these military men inflicted, simply written off as byproducts of pastoral expansion, were necessary means by which the colonisation project could proceed. Vigilante violence worked hand in hand with official operations to annex the tableland and dominate its people. What little information was reported at the time about colonists' atrocities against New England Aborigines is supplemented by damning evidence contained within memoirs, station histories, and Aboriginal oral history. Susan Young, whose father, Edward Clark, came to the region in 1836 and established Bundarra Station, where my grandfather was born, mentions her reminiscences of a poisoning of the blacks at the McDonald River Station by putting arsenic in the milk. This incident may be why a watercourse near the village of Bendemeer was named Poison Swamp Creek. Elizabeth Gardner's study of Terrible Vale documents a story passed down through some people who worked on the station that a large number of Aborigines were killed near the creek on Terrible Vale in the early days of the settlement. There's a fucking book full of this shit. They colonised, they terrorised, they brutalised, they murdered, they raped, they pillaged not only the poor people but their country, and they're still doing it. They call it progress. It's total destruction. We were a unique people with a unique system here. What they took from my people, they'll never replace. They occupy this country, but they'll never own it. We own this country. You can live a lie, you can deny the truth all you like, but the truth will always be truth no matter what. Cecil Briggs, veteran Gumbaynggirr land rights campaigner. Mapping incidents on the frontier conflict across the southern half of the New England district. Number, when, where, description, page. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Late 1830s, early 1840s. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Early 1840s. 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. 1844. Morden Station. 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38. June 1860. Mount Mitchell. Hundreds of warriors streamed into the Oban River from the Bellinger River. They slaughtered cattle en masse at Mount Mitchell. Oban Aborigines acted as guides and spies for their coastal kin. 39, 40, 41, 42. Right? That's 42 incidents of Aborigines fighting back and being killed in New England. As we're getting to the end of my phone's capacity to record video, I might close out with this particular description of something that I had never previously encountered in any description of shit that white people have done to Aborigines. The description starts there, comes over to here, and we have a picture. But in the interest of context, I'm going to start reading here. The conspiracy of silence in the aftermath of Mile Creek has meant that the records of such vigilante action are conspicuously rare in comparison to reports of Aboriginal people acting in defence of their lands and lives. Nevertheless, the few records available offer a glimpse into the raw reality of the widespread repressive violence upon which New England's pastoral industry was established and developed. John Everett wrote to his brother William in June 1841 that those Aborigines responsible for the recent killing of a white man in the district were, quote, made to repent it in numbers of their tribe having been shot by parties who went out in pursuit, unquote. Everett was perhaps alluding here to the shepherd killed on Dangar's Ghostwick run a few months earlier, also raising the subject of frontier massacre. The Australasian Chronicle in December 1839 drew its readers' attention to the brutality of, quote, some young fellows residing in the New England district who lately boasted in Sydney that they were in the habit of poisoning the natives with arsenic and shooting them, etc., unquote. My grandfather's younger brother, Clifford Schmutter, told how colonists, quote, herded the old people, women and children to a place up there at Ryamuka, bracket, southeast of Walker, close bracket, and killed them all, unquote. This violence was often indiscriminate and not always retaliatory. Donald Jameson, the grandson of William Jameson, who took up Surveyors Creek Station with John Connell in the early 1840s, details in his book, quote, Tales at Old Inglebar, unquote, how station workers planned and carried out an unprovoked attack on the Ambiyang tribe. Their supposed aim was, quote, on account of the awful noise so close at hand during the night, unquote, to deter local Aborigines from engaging in ceremonial activities nearby the local homestead, where they'd been conducting ceremonies for 40,000 fucking years before the homestead appeared. There was a huge white gum log on the flat just above the house and quite close to where they held their corroboree. They would light fires alongside each side of this log, and there they would commence their dancing and singing just on dark. So the log is reflecting the light and the sound, giving them a double-sided stage kind of thing. The station workers got about 120 pounds, 50 kilograms of gunpowder, bored 2-inch auger holes in the log at a distance of about 3 feet apart and into the centre of the log on both sides. These they filled with gunpowder, rammed as tight as they could with paper over it, and on top they placed a coating of mud. As it would be getting dark when the natives came to light their fires, the white men reckoned they would not notice anything unusual about their log, which turned out to be perfectly correct. Just as it was getting dark, the men at the huts saw the fires start up, and the natives were seen in the light, lining up for the corroboree. With a frightful roar, the thing blew up. There were pieces of burning wood of all sizes hurled hundreds of feet into the air, and millions of sparks made the country all around where the log had been as light as day. Add to this the roar of the explosion and thud of falling timber as it hit the ground, and it was enough to scare the life out of the stoutest-hearted native who ever lived. And as the noise died away, the shrieks of the natives could be heard as they fled in all directions. What became of the tribe for the next 6 months was never known. They disappeared from their usual hunting grounds, and not a trace was ever seen of them during the whole of that time. Not even the stockmen riding the run after the cattle or the shepherds tending their sheep saw anything of it until they suddenly appeared again, but not to take possession of their old camp. When they returned, they made their camp on the river about 2 miles below the Inglebar homestead, and there they remained until, in after years, the government granted them a reserve of 140 acres for their own special use. Such acts of terror had the desired effects of excluding the Aboriginal people from certain sections of their homeland, including places of cultural and economic significant importance, and played a role in suffocating localised culture, practice and traditional life. In a profile of the New England district written in the 1880s, the following was said of Major Park's, quote, reign of terror and its effect in keeping Aborigines fearful and oppressed long after he took up Guy Fawkes Station in the mid-1840s. Quote, the name of the gentleman in question is held in awe by the darkies till present day, and to mention it is sufficient to induce any stray Aborigine to make backtracks to the nearest shelter. James Marks of Emu's Creek Station was another of the district's graziers who had a reputation for acting with what Charles Cox and a fellow squatter described as undue severity among the natives. Dudes, I could fucking go on and on and on and on and on, but there's only 9 minutes and 21 left on the camera's ability to continue recording. So let us finish with some graphs. Colonial population in growth in New England and neighbouring commissioners' districts' earliest occupation to 1861. Blue, New England district. Dark blue, Liverpool Plains and Guida districts. That's the west. Green is the Darling of the Downs district in the north. Orange is Macleay River and Clarence district. So Macleay and Clarence River district is your orange. Darling Downs is your green. Liverpool Plains is your dark blue. 1833 here, New England district. Bang. By 1845, New England had surpassed the Liverpool Plains and the Guarda districts, and it continued to rise higher and faster. That's how fast the white bastards were here. By 1860, you're talking nearly 10,000. By 1843, 1,700 white people in the New England tablelands. Colonial population of New England and neighbouring commissioners' districts, earliest occupations to 1861. Number of colonists per 1,000 kilometre. 300, 200, 100. New England district starts here, right? By 1842, the number of colonists per 1,000 square kilometres in the New England tablelands was equal to what they were in the Liverpool Plains, Guarda districts, and the Maclean Clarence. Darling Downs, it was nothing like that. Darling Downs didn't approach New England's kind of ever, really, in the 1800s anyway. Decimated and overpopulated. Aboriginal populations of New England and neighbouring districts at the time of earliest colonial occupation. New England, 1,100 and 1,200. Liverpool Plains, Guarda River, 4,500 to 5,500. Darling Downs, 1,500 to 2,000. Clarence River, 2,200 to 2,300. Macleay River, 2,500 to 3,000. There was only 1,200 Aborigines in the whole of the New England tablelands. And within 10 years of the first sheep, there were as many white people in the New England tablelands as there used to be Aborigines, and there were 100,000 bloody sheep within the first 10 years. Colonial population degrowth and Aboriginal population decline in the New England tablelands, 1832 to 1861. There we go. That's 2,500, that's zero. So what we're looking at there is 1,200. Aboriginal population going down. White population going up. Crossover point, 10, perhaps 12 years after the European colonists arrived and commenced the sheep and potato wars. It's enough to make a person ashamed of being a white Australian. That's why I really, really, really hope my mother's father was a secret blackfella passing for white. Because if he was the first Aboriginal officer in the Australian Imperial Forces. He was the first Aboriginal pilot to get a licence. Wouldn't that be nice, eh? And isn't it fucking sad that people like my mother and her brother and sisters had their heads so far stuck up their mother's white fucking Irish ascendant's arsehole that they've denied anything their father ever did because, he wasn't enlisted as a pilot because he didn't finish high school. Eddie Rickenbacker didn't finish high school. Mick Mannock was fucking blind in one eye. In World War One, if you had a pilot's licence, you were in. But not if you were black. You couldn't fly. You couldn't be an officer with a touch of the tar brush. Not until you got to England, where the life of a pilot in the Australian Flying Corps was estimated at 21 days. They wanted pilots, even if they were black. So who knows? Do you know, Clippy? Do you know whether I'm a secret blackfella passing for white? Because I haven't got a fucking clue. Do you? Ecocide and the dismantling of Aboriginal independence. Livestock population of New England and neighbouring districts, earliest occupation to 1856. New England district, starting in 1832. By 1840, 10,000 sheep. Number of sheep and cattle per 1 kilometre square. Sheep and cattle per kilometre? Oh, okay. 12 per kilometre. 12 sheep per square kilometre. 12 sheep per square kilometre on the whole of the New England tablelands, and I'm pretty sure the New England tablelands is 100,000 square kilometres. Maybe it's only 10,000 square kilometres? 100 kilometres by 100 kilometres? Yeah, 10,000 square kilometres, 12 per square kilometre. Okay. 112,000 sheep. No bloody wonder the ecology collapsed within 10 years. No wonder there's no Aborigines around here who can talk the local dialect. At the funeral, Mari Burns' great-great-great-granddaughter Poppy delivered the welcome to country in Ngurrabal. It's the most Ngurrabal I've ever heard sprung together in one statement in 62 years of living here, 61 years of living here. So yeah, livestock density, 112,000 sheep in the first 10 years, where 1,200 people used to live. We have pastels, pencils, what appear to be watercolours, maybe acrylics, pastel, I think, more pastel, Aborigines in chains, horses, guns and steel. Oh shit, the natives are now armed with our firearms, boo-hoo, sob-sob. When I asked the tribal elders in 1988 why the Aborigines weren't actually looking for fucking hand grenades to do a bicentennial genocide extermination, they said it's a religious thing. Aborigines did not bring the white man to Australia. That was Biami's doing. Biami had a purpose for that. Aborigines don't know what it was. If Biami wants to get rid of the white men on Australia, it'll be up to Biami to do that. It's not the Aborigines' job, because the Aborigines didn't bring the white men here. How Biami gets rid of the white men, it's going to be up to Biami. Not anything to do with the Aboriginal people. Their job is to keep culture together so that when the white fella's ways are gone, somebody knows how to move forward. Because as they said to me 25 years ago, if the white fellas keep going in the way they've been going the last 250 years, in another 100 years there won't be any of the bastards left. They will have killed everything and they will have died out. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Australia Day, Invasion Day actually. Ciao.